God bless y'all. Have y'all ever noticed that the greatest obstacles in our walk with God are often not about the circumstances around us, but the condition of our hearts? Numbers 14 through 16, these chapters aren't just about the Israelites wandering through the wilderness. They're about unbelief, obedience, rebellion, and God's incredible mercy. Now, reading these, they also remind me that God takes his holiness seriously and calls his people to trust him completely. These events begin, y'all, as Israel stands on the edge of the promised land. Keep in mind, I just said the edge. God had done everything he said he would do. He delivered them from Egypt through mighty signs and wonders. He parted the Red Sea. He destroyed Pharaoh's army. He fed them with manna from heaven. He brought water from a rock and led them by the pillar of the cloud during the day and a pillar of fire by night. Time after time, y'all, God had proven himself faithful. But like I talked about in yesterday's video, the 12 spies, they returned after searching the land for 40 days. All 12 agreed on one thing. The land was exactly as God has promised. It truly flowed with milk and honey, y'all. The difference wasn't what they saw, it's how they responded to what they saw. 10 spies focused on the giants, the fortified cities, and the strength of the enemy, and Joshua and Caleb, they saw those very same obstacles, but they chose to trust God's promise instead of their circumstances. Faith, it doesn't deny the obstacles. It does not deny that obstacles exist. Faith believes that God is greater than the obstacles. Unfortunately, y'all, the people believed the report of the 10 spies instead of Joshua and Caleb, and fear spread throughout the camp. The congregation cried through the night and complained again to Moses and Aaron, and they wished they had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. They even talked about appointing another leader to take them back to Egypt. Make that make sense, y'all. It's amazing how fear can distort our perspective. Egypt have been a place of slavery, oppression, and suffering. Yet when they were feared or scared, they began looking back as though it had been better than following God. Fear often causes us to forget God's faithfulness and focuses only on our present circumstances. Joshua and Caleb, they tore their clothes as a sign of grief and pleaded with the people not to rebel against them. They reminded Israel that if the Lord delighted in them, he would bring them into the land because he had already promised to do so. So they urged the people not to fear the inhabitants of Canaan because the Lord was with them. So instead of listening, the congregation talked about stoning Joshua and Caleb. Go figure. That reminds us that speaking God's truth isn't always welcome. People, they don't always reject God's messages because they're wrong. Sometimes they reject them because they don't want to hear what God is saying. Then, moving on, y'all, to scripture, the glory of the Lord appeared before all the congregation. God asked Moses, how long will these people provoke me? And how long will it be that they believe me for all the sign which I have shewed among them? Their greatest problem wasn't fear, y'all. It was unbelief. They had seen God's power repeatedly, yet they still refused to trust his word. Rather than being angry with the people, Moses immediately interceded for them. In verses 13 through 19, he appealed to God's own character. Moses reminded the Lord that he had revealed himself through long suffering. He was merciful, forgiving iniquity and transgressions, but as he was also just. Moses wasn't reminding God because God had forgotten. He was appearing to the character God had already revealed about himself. Now, this is one of the many places where Moses points us forward to Jesus Christ. Moses stood between the people and God's judgment, pleading for mercy, in the same way Jesus Christ continually intercedes for us that belong to him. Romans chapter 8, verse 34 tells us that Christ maketh intercession for us. God then answered Moses and said he had pardoned the people according to Moses' request. However, forgiveness didn't remove the consequences of their unbelief, y'all. The adults who continually refused to trust God wouldn't enter the promised land. Joshua and Caleb would enter because they believed the Lord, but the rest of that unbelieving generation would die in the wilderness. And verse 24 says that Caleb had another spirit and followed me fully. Caleb wasn't perfect, y'all, but he wholeheartedly followed the Lord when everyone around him chose fear. He looked at the same giants everyone else saw, yet his confidence rested in God's promise instead of human ability. Now, One of the most remarkable statements in this chapter is found in verse 31. Verse 31 says, "But your little ones, which ye said should be a prey, them will I bring in, and they shall know the land which ye have despised. But as for you, your carcasses, they shall fall in this wilderness. And your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years and bear your whoredoms until your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness." That's verse 31 through 33, y'all, in chapter 14 of Numbers. That's basically saying that the Israelites, they were scared that their children would become victims if they entered the land, but God declared that those very children would inherit the promised land. The parents' unbelief caused them to miss the promise, but God's faithfulness would ensure the next generation received what he promised. God also declared that since the spies had searched the land for 40 days, Israel would wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Each year of wandering corresponded to one day. The land had been searched. 40 days turned into 40 years. Their unbelief had consequences not only for themselves, but for an entire generation. That's why we should watch what we do. When Moses finished speaking God's judgment, the people suddenly decided they were ready to obey. They got up early the next morning and attempted to enter the land anyway. But there was a problem, y'all. It was a big problem. They were trying to obey in their own terms instead of God's. Moses warned them not to go because the Lord would not be with them. He told them they would be defeated by their enemies because they had already rejected God's command. But guess what? They went anyway. Verse 41 through 45, it teaches us a great lesson, y'all. Israel refused to obey God when God told them to go, and then they tried to go after God told them to stop. Delayed obedience became disobedience. The problem was never the giants. The problem was that they went without God. Moses stayed back. The tabernacle stayed back. They just went by themselves. So what I mean when I say Moses stayed back, he remained in the camp. The Ark of the Covenant remained in the camp. God's presence was not with their mission because they had chosen their own timing instead of his. As a result, they were defeated by the Amalekites and the Canaanites in a place later associated with Hormah, Hormah, a name connected with destruction. This chapter leaves us with several important lessons, y'all. First, the voices we listen to, they matter. 10 men discouraged an entire nation. One fearful report affected thousands. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33 says, "Evil communications corrupts good manners." 2, the majority doesn't equal truth. 10 spies versus 2 spies. The majority was wrong. Matthew chapter 4, verses 13 through 14, Jesus said many would travel the broad way and few find the narrow way, meaning truth is never determined in numbers, should I say. Number 3, unbelief. Well, let me take it back, y'all. I cannot say that I can't use that word never. So I would say truth isn't determined in numbers. Number 3, unbelief has consequences. God forgave Israel, but consequences remain. Forgiveness removes guilt, but it doesn't always remove the consequences. That's in Galatians. Well, I made a comparison to Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. "Whatsoever a man soweth, that he shall also reap." Number 4, Moses stood between God's judgment and the people. Moses points forward to Jesus. He intercedes for Israel, and Jesus intercedes for us. That points me to Romans chapter 8, verse 34. Christ maketh intercession for us. And number 5, Joshua and Caleb, they were examples of faith. In chapter 14, verse 24, God said Caleb had another spirit. Had another spirit with him, meaning a different attitude, perspective, and different faith. Everyone else saw giants, but he saw God's promises. This New Testament connection means that faith doesn't deny obstacles, y'all. Faith it believes God is greater than our obstacles.